The year was 334 BC. A thin mist hung over the narrow waters of the Hellespont, the ancient divide between Europe and Asia. At its edge stood a young Macedonian king whose ambition stretched further than any horizon. His name was Alexander. He had inherited from his father, Philip II, not only a powerful army but also a dream, to lead the Greeks into Asia and to bring the Persian Empire to its knees. Now, barely 22 years old, he was about to take the first step toward that dream. Before dawn, Alexander performed a ritual. He poured a libation into the sea and offered a sacrifice to Poseidon, the god of the waters. Then he boarded his flagship, grasped his spear, and pointed it toward the eastern shore. When the prow touched land, he hurled the spear into the soil and declared that Asia was now won by the spear of the Greeks. It was a symbolic act, and the first mark of a campaign that would reshape the world. Across the strait lay the satrapies of the Persian king Darius III. For nearly 2 centuries, Persia had been the master of Asia Minor. Its rule reached from the Aegean coast to the mountains of Armenia, from Syria to the Caspian Sea. The empire was vast, but age had dulled its edge. Rebellion simmered in the provinces, and the authority of Darius was weaker in the west than it appeared on his royal inscriptions. When the Macedonian army landed, it numbered about 37,000 men. 13,000 were cavalry, the rest were heavy infantry and light auxiliaries. It was a small force compared with the vast manpower of Persia, but it was disciplined, experienced, and led by a commander of genius. The Persian response came quickly. Spithridates, Arcides, and Mithridates, the local governors of Lydia, Phrygia, and Cappadocia, gathered their contingents near a river called Granicus. They chose the ground carefully. The river cut through steep banks and fast-moving water. The Persian cavalry would hold the far side and strike the Macedonians as they tried to cross. In theory, it was the perfect defensive position. Alexander marched north to meet them. He reached the Granicus at midday and surveyed the field from a low ridge. To his left stretched a broad plain, ahead, the Persian line glittered with armor. Their cavalry stood in the front rank, an unusual formation, and behind them waited thousands of Greek mercenaries hired by the satraps. It was a display of confidence, even arrogance. Parmenion, Alexander's most senior general, advised caution. He urged his king to wait until morning, to let the army rest and attack when the light favored them. Alexander refused. He had studied the Persians, he knew that delay would only strengthen their morale. He intended to strike at once and to strike hard. In the late afternoon, he arrayed his army for battle. The left wing under Parmenion took position downstream, facing the Persian right. The center was formed by the solid wall of the Macedonian phalanx, 16 ranks deep, shields locked, pikes angled forward. On the right, Alexander placed the companion cavalry, the elite of Macedonia, men who had trained beside him since boyhood. He himself rode at their head, wearing a white plume above his helmet so his soldiers could always see him in the fight. As the sun began to sink, Alexander gave the signal. Trumpets sounded, hooves thundered, and the first line of cavalry plunged into the river. The current was cold and swift, horses stumbled over slippery stones. Persian arrows hissed through the air, striking men and beasts alike. Still, the Macedonians pressed on, shields raised, spears lowered. When the leading squadrons reached the far bank, they met the Persian horse in a violent collision. The riverbank became a chaos of shouting, splashing, and steel. From the opposite ridge, Alexander watched the struggle for a brief moment, then spurred Bucephalus forward and entered the fray himself. His wedge of companions cut into the Persian left. Lances shattered, swords flashed, horses screamed. The young king fought in the thick of it, striking at the enemy line where it was strongest. A Persian nobleman, Spithridates, charged directly at him and swung a curved saber toward his head. The blade caught Alexander's crest and sliced his helmet open. Before the second blow could fall, Clitus the Black, his friend and bodyguard, drove a spear through Spithridate's throat. Alexander turned, blood running down his cheek, and shouted for his men to push forward. The Persian formation began to waver. Their cavalry, crowded on the narrow bank, had no room to maneuver. As the companions forced them back, the Macedonian infantry crossed the river in solid ranks. Once the phalanx gained the far shore, the outcome was certain. Within an hour, the Persian horse was broken. The surviving riders fled toward the plateau, leaving the Greek mercenaries exposed. They stood firm, forming a dense square with shields overlapping, but Alexander would not give them rest. He ordered his infantry to encircle them and his cavalry to attack from the rear. The mercenaries fought bravely, but they were outmatched. When the killing ended, more than 1,000 Persians lay dead, and nearly 20,000 were taken prisoner. The Macedonian losses were astonishingly small, about 120 men. Among them were 25 companions, whose names Alexander later sent home to be engraved in bronze at Dion. As darkness fell, he walked the field himself. He sought out the bodies of his fallen friends and ordered that they be buried with honor. To the Greek mercenaries who had fought for Persia, he showed no mercy. They were sold into slavery as traitors to the Hellenic cause. The victory at Granicus was complete. It opened the road into Asia Minor and sent a message that thundered across the empire of Darius III. The Macedonians were coming, and they could not be stopped. That night, as campfires flickered along the river, Alexander sat apart from his generals. He stared at the dark water, hearing the faint sound of the current against the stones. This was only the beginning. Issus, Tyre, Egypt, Gaugamela, all waited beyond that river. But here, at Granicus, a conqueror had been born. The sun had barely lifted above the dusty Anatolian hills when Alexander's army began to move. Before them flowed the river Granicus, calm on the surface, but treacherous underneath. Its steep banks and swirling current made it the perfect defensive line for the Persians. And on the opposite shore, a glittering wall of enemy cavalry waited, thousands of them, their bronze helmets flashing like fire in the morning light. The air was heavy with tension. The Macedonians stood silently, gripping their spears, listening to the distant drums of Persia. No one spoke. Every man knew that what happened here would echo across the world. Parmenion, Alexander's most trusted general, urged caution. "My king," he said quietly, "let the men rest. The river runs deep, and the Persians are waiting. Attack at dawn tomorrow." But Alexander's blue eyes blazed. He turned to his officers and said, "Would you have me cross the river tomorrow, when they are ready, or today, when they think I will not?" He spurred his horse forward. The trumpets sounded. And the army followed their king into the torrent. The first rank splashed into the river. Water surged around their waists, the current tugging hard at their legs. Arrows whistled through the air, cutting into the ranks. Persian javelins rained down from the far bank. But Alexander did not slow. He led the companion cavalry straight through the deepest part of the river, his golden helmet gleaming like a beacon. Behind him, his men raised their long lances, the ziston, and charged uphill toward the Persian horsemen. The shock was brutal. The Macedonian charge smashed into the Persian front line with the sound of thunder. Lances splintered, horses screamed, and men vanished under the crush. Alexander's strategy was risky, insane, even. He was attacking uphill, through water, against superior numbers. But his plan wasn't just to cross. He wanted to draw the Persian commanders toward him, to strike at their very heart. At first, the Persians held. Their cavalry, proud nobles from across Asia Minor, formed a wall of shields and spears. They fought bravely, their gold-trimmed armor shining under the rising sun. But Alexander's men fought like possessed lions, pushing forward, step by step. Suddenly, Alexander saw his moment. A Persian noble, Mithridates, son-in-law of the great King Darius, rode toward him, leading an elite squadron. Alexander lowered his lance and charged. The two lines collided. In the chaos, Alexander's spear struck Mithridates full in the face, killing him instantly. Another noble, Rosaces, slashed at Alexander with a sword, slicing through his helmet and drawing blood. But before the blow could fall again, Clitus the Black, Alexander's loyal friend, rode in and struck Rosaces down, saving the king's life. The Macedonians roared. They saw their king bleeding, but still fighting, still pressing forward. It ignited something wild inside them. They surged up the bank, driving the Persians back with sheer fury. Within minutes, the once solid Persian line began to falter. Men who had come to kill a young, reckless invader now found themselves face to face with destiny, and losing. On the left flank, Parmenion's infantry crossed in force, taking advantage of the distraction. Their long sarissas bristled like a field of steel. Step by step, they climbed the muddy bank and joined the fight. The Persians, surrounded and disorganized, began to crumble. Their cavalry, trapped between the Macedonian advance and the river, had nowhere to go. Men fell into the water, dragged down by the weight of their armor. The river that had been their shield was now their grave. By mid-morning, the Persian cavalry was broken. Those who could, fled. Those who couldn't, died where they stood. The once mighty satraps of Asia Minor watched their armies dissolve before their eyes. Alexander, panting and blood-streaked, raised his sword and shouted for the pursuit to stop. He knew victory was his, but he also knew the Persians were not yet finished. Across the field, the infantry still waited, tens of thousands of Greek mercenaries fighting for Persia, trapped and terrified. Alexander turned his horse and pointed toward them. "Now," he said, "let us finish what we began." And once again, the trumpets sounded. As the dust settled over the riverbank, the scene was chaos. Broken spears and shattered shields floated in the shallow water. The cries of the wounded echoed across the plain. But the battle was not yet over. Across the field stood the Persian infantry, 10,000 hardened Greek mercenaries, hired swords from across the Aegean. They had watched the slaughter of their Persian allies, but they had not moved. They were disciplined, experienced, and ready to fight. Unlike the Persian nobles who had fled, these men were professionals, killers of kings and conquerors alike. Alexander reined in his horse, scanning their ranks. He knew these men well. Many had once fought alongside his own father, Philip II. Now they stood against him, for Persian gold. Parmenion approached, his armor dented, his face streaked with sweat. "My king," he said, "they are Greeks. They will not yield easily." Alexander's eyes narrowed. "All the more reason," he said quietly, "to show them that Greece will never again fight against Greece." He gave the order. The phalanx advanced, long lines of sarissas glittering under the Anatolian sun. Step by step, the Macedonian infantry moved forward in perfect formation. Their shields locked. Their pikes leveled. And behind them, the dust rose like a storm. The mercenaries braced themselves. They shouted their war cries, slamming swords against shields. They had nowhere to run, the Granicus River behind them, Alexander's army before them. There would be no surrender, no retreat. When the two lines met, the sound was like the breaking of a mountain. The clash of metal and the screams of men filled the air. The Macedonian sarissas thrust forward relentlessly, pushing the mercenaries back with every step. But the Greeks fought with desperate courage. They hacked at the pikes, grabbed the shafts, and dragged the Macedonians into brutal hand-to-hand combat. For a moment, the battlefield became a single storm of chaos. Blood soaked the ground. Armor clashed. Voices cried out, in Greek, in Macedonian, in Persian. Brother fought brother under the same sun. Alexander's cavalry wheeled around to strike from the flank. Caught between spear and sword, the mercenaries began to collapse inward. Their commander, Memnon of Rhodes, fought like a lion, trying to rally his men. He knew the Persians had failed them. He knew the battle was lost, but not his honor. Hold the line, he shouted. For Greece. But it was too late. Alexander's horsemen crashed into their side, breaking what little order remained. The mercenary ranks buckled under the weight of the attack. Men fell by the hundreds, trampled under hooves, cut down by swords. Some dropped their weapons and begged for mercy. Others fought until the end. When the dust finally cleared, nearly every mercenary on the field lay dead. Out of 10,000, only about 2,000 survived. Alexander spared them, not out of mercy, but out of message. He sent them in chains back to Macedonia to work as slaves, so that every Greek would know what happened to those who fought against their own. He rode slowly across the field, surveying the carnage. The once proud Persian army was gone. The satraps, the governors of Asia Minor, were dead or in flight. And the young king, not yet 22 years old, had achieved what few thought possible. The world had seen Alexander's first test, and he had not just survived it. He had conquered it. The survivors whispered of his courage, his madness, his genius. Even his enemies began to see him not just as a general, but as a force of nature. A storm in human form. As his men cheered, Alexander dismounted and knelt beside the river. He washed the blood from his hands, his own and that of thousands. Then he looked toward the east, where the sun was climbing high above the plains. Persia lay beyond that horizon, vast, ancient, and powerful. But after the Granicus, the first crack had appeared in its empire. And Alexander intended to tear it open. He turned to his generals and said quietly, "This was only the beginning." The field of Granicus lay silent. Only the wind moved now, carrying the smell of dust and iron. The river that had witnessed so much blood ran red as it curled through the corpses of men and horses. Alexander stood at the center of it all, his armor dented, his cloak dark with sweat and blood. He was exhausted, but his eyes burned with a fire that no fatigue could dim. For him, the Battle of the Granicus was not only a victory, it was a declaration. A message to the world that a new power had risen. His officers gathered around him. Parmenion, proud yet cautious. Clitus the Black, still shaken from the moment he had saved his king's life. And near them, the body of a young nobleman who had fallen at Alexander's side, one of the many who had died to carve his path to glory. Alexander ordered the dead to be buried with honor, Macedonian and Persian alike. He knew that glory without respect would turn to arrogance, and arrogance would destroy an empire before it began. So he walked among the wounded himself, praising the living, comforting the dying. Every man who had fought that day felt seen, remembered by his king. By nightfall, fires burned across the plain. The Macedonian camp was alive with music, cheers, and relief. Men sang songs of victory, they called Alexander the Thunderbolt. But the king remained silent, gazing eastward into the darkness. There, beyond the mountains and deserts, waited the true enemy, Darius III, King of Kings. Granicus had been only a border skirmish compared to what was coming. The next morning, Alexander entered the city of Sardis, the richest in Western Asia Minor. Its gates opened without resistance. The Persian satrap had fled during the night, leaving behind treasure, arms, and the keys to Lydia. In the city's grand hall, the people of Sardis knelt before Alexander and offered him the citadel. It was said no army had ever taken Sardis by force in all of history, yet Alexander claimed it without drawing a sword. His legend was spreading faster than his army could march. From there, he moved along the Ionian coast, freeing Greek cities that had lived under Persian rule for centuries. In Ephesus, the crowds hailed him as a liberator. In Miletus, he crushed the Persian garrison after a fierce siege. In Halicarnassus, he faced one of Persia's best generals, Memnon of Rhodes, the same commander who had survived Granicus. The city burned, but Alexander's flag rose over its walls. Everywhere he went, he left behind both awe and fear. For the Greeks, he was a hero fulfilling his father's dream. For the Persians, he was a storm that would not stop. But even in victory, Alexander was learning. At Granicus, he had nearly died, a single sword stroke away from ending his empire before it began. He never forgot it. From that day onward, he wore a lighter helmet and rode closer to his companions, never ahead of them. Yet his courage never dimmed. He wrote letters to Greece announcing the victory, sending back armor and spoils to be hung in temples as offerings to the gods. On the captured Persian shields, he ordered an inscription carved. Alexander, son of Philip, and all the Greeks, except the Spartans, dedicate these to the gods, taken from the barbarians of Asia. It was both a tribute and a taunt. To the Persians, that their domination was ending. To the Spartans, that Greece had found a new master. But victory brought more than glory, it brought challenges. His men were tired, far from home, and surrounded by unfamiliar lands. Rumors spread that Darius was gathering a massive army to crush them. Some officers urged Alexander to pause, to consolidate, to rest. He refused. "The world will not wait for those who hesitate," he said. "If we stop now, we will never start again." So the army pressed on, deeper into Asia, chasing the shadow of Darius across mountains, plains, and rivers. Each step carried them further from Macedonia, and closer to immortality. Alexander knew that history rarely remembers those who play it safe. It remembers those who risk everything. And at Granicus, he had learned that risk was the very heart of greatness. The Battle of the Granicus was over. But its echo rolled across continents. In the courts of Persia, word of the defeat spread like wildfire. King Darius III could not believe what he heard. A boy from Macedonia, barely 22 years old, had shattered the army of Asia's western satraps. His generals swore it was luck, a river fight, a fluke. But deep down, Darius knew the truth. He had underestimated a force that would soon shake the foundations of his empire. In Greece, news of the victory arrived weeks later. Messengers rode from village to village, shouting the name that would soon become legend, Alexander. In Athens, people gathered in the agora to hear of the battle. In Sparta, they listened in silence, proud but wary. And in Macedonia, old soldiers wept, knowing their king's son had already done what few men in history could. But for Alexander, Granicus was more than victory. It was proof that the impossible could be done. That the gods favored him. That destiny itself walked beside him. Each night, he studied his maps by the light of a flickering torch, his fingers tracing the lands still ruled by Persia, Phrygia, Cilicia, Syria, Egypt, Babylon. Each name whispered a challenge. Each border was another test. He told his generals. Granicus was only the door. Beyond it lies the empire of the world. And his men believed him. Because they had seen what he could do. They had seen him ride through a river of death and emerge untouched, his sword dripping with victory. Yet victory came at a price. The Granicus River had swallowed many brave men, companions, friends, brothers in arms. In his tent that night, Alexander wrote letters to their families, praising their courage and promising that their names would never be forgotten. He kept his word. Their graves were marked, their deeds recorded. Even the Persian dead were buried with honor. This was not mere mercy, it was strategy. Alexander understood that respect could conquer hearts where weapons could not. By honoring the fallen Persians, he turned enemies into subjects, and subjects into loyal followers. As spring turned to summer, the young king's army moved deeper into Asia Minor. City after city fell, not always by battle, but by belief. Many opened their gates without resistance, swearing allegiance to him. The legend of Granicus preceded him wherever he went. In taverns, temples, and marketplaces, people whispered of the warrior who had crossed a raging river to face death, and won. His image began to change. He was no longer seen as just a conqueror, but as something greater. A symbol of destiny, of divine purpose, of unbreakable will. The Persians called him the demon from the west. His own men called him the Great. And history would remember him as Alexander the Great. The man who began his empire with a single leap across the Granicus. Years later, as his empire stretched from Greece to India, Alexander often looked back on that first great battle. He would tell his officers, "Granicus was where I learned that courage is stronger than numbers. And destiny favors the bold." For it was at Granicus that the boy became a leader. And the leader became a legend. The river still flows today, silent and unassuming, cutting through the plains of modern Turkey. But if you stand there long enough, and let the wind sweep across the stones, you can almost hear it. The thunder of hooves, the clash of bronze, and the voice of a young king shouting above the chaos. Forward! The world is ours to take.